So, last time we talked about the people that that make you feel like you matter, but you don't actually matter. The people that manipulate you, right, to profit off of you. This week, I want to talk about Psyops, which, if you don't know what that is, it's psychological operations, right? This is something usually conducted by a government or military body, which is not what I'm talking about here, right? But the concept is still the same. I'm going to have a guy that I use a lot in this series. He's called Yuri Bezmenov.
Application of subversion. In case of religion, destroy it.
He was in the KGB, which is the Soviet Union's equivalent to the CIA, right? Which is the Central Intelligence Agency. Intelligence means information, by the way. He defected in, I think it was the 80s, and he gave a bunch of interviews and a bunch of lectures basically talking about the tactics and psychological operations that the KGB used to sway America. And it's quite chilling if you watch them. I'm going to have him in here a lot, but...
The bodies of people, groups of people, whom nobody elected. Never. As a matter of fact, most of the people don't like them at all, and yet they exist. One of such group is media. Who elected them? How come they have so much power?
The psyops that I'm talking about aren't perpetrated by any government body or anything like that. I'm talking about psyops in the sense of psychological attacks on people, right? The idea of deliberately shifting what people think, right? And for this to make sense, right, I want you to ask yourself a couple questions, right? And that is, how much of what you believe and what you think is important and who you are, how much of that came from you? And how much of that came because somebody else told you to think it? And the reason that I want you to ask this question is it goes back to what I talked to you about influencers last time, right? These people that want vulnerable people to feel a sense of belonging and to be a part of their communities, right? And then they use that to then shoehorn their ideology into it, right? How is that not a psyop? Right? You think about what these people push. Like, what do they actually tell you? It goes back to what I said about, like, you see these fucking kids with this weird sex shit in their bios and stuff like that. It's like, where did they learn that, right? Makes you think. When you're growing up and you're vulnerable, right, and you don't really have a sense of identity, you tend to look for one, right?
You cannot subvert an enemy which doesn't want to be subverted.
And if the person telling you what to think doesn't have your best interests in mind, should you listen to them? Of course not, right? We talked about that last time. But, right, the psyops that I'm talking about here aren't necessarily targeted at causing this effect, right? They could be for marketing or whatever. They just getting people whipped up to have a sort of tribalistic association with a brand or a personality, right? But it's your life. So why are you letting yourself be manipulated? Why aren't you actually looking inside of yourself and seeing what matters to you?
What it includes? It includes influencing or by various methods, infiltration, propaganda methods, direct contacts, doesn't really matter.
And I think it's because it's easier when somebody tells you how things are. When somebody tells you, this is the way things are, and oh, isn't it so horrible, and and you should be concerned about these things. Like, it goes back to what I said before. When I was fucking 14 years old, I wasn't concerned with beheading landlords. Right? But now a bunch of 14-year-olds are. Why aren't they concerned with developing themselves as people? It's a psychological operation in one form or another, right? This sort of manipulation of what is acceptable and what is okay. You think cancel culture, for example, is a perfect example of a psyop, right? Where you convince enough people to believe in something that doesn't make any sense. Let me tell you why cancel culture doesn't make any sense, right? You ever listen to music? Well, you shouldn't be, because the people that made it are probably horrible. Led Zeppelin, pedophiles, right? And yet we still appreciate good art. It's not normal to suddenly convince everybody to not appreciate anything good because a bad person might have touched it at one point or another. What you're really doing is creating a bunch of frustrated, angry people. And you're getting them angry over what you think they should be angry about, not what they're actually angry about, right? Does it make sense? I'm trying to think of where I should even go from here. Oh, I know what I'm talking about. The reason I call this a psyop is one of the main things that Bezmenov talks about. Also, I've wanted to make a video on Bezmenov for a very long time, but I actually couldn't. Because every time you'd post him on YouTube, the video would get deleted, believe it or not. And thank you to the new Call of Duty trailer for finally putting him in there, so I assume they're not going to delete that one. So I guess I can make this video now, right? One of the main things that Bezmenov talks about is this concept of demoralization. The idea that you can basically beat people down into believing what you believe and feeling guilty about who they are or something.
The first stage of subversion is the process which is called, basically, demoralization. It takes from, say, 15 to 20 years to demoralize a society. Why 15 or 20 years? This is the time sufficient to educate one generation of students or children. One generation.
You can beat them down to the point that they can't even see what's true anymore. They don't even know what they want, right? I think the way that he puts it is they won't realize that they're in deep shit until they have a gun in their back, right? It's almost like you become incapable of seeing the truth because your concept of what is the truth is not based on your own experiences. It's not based on any sort of observational data that you've gathered in your life. Instead, it's based on what somebody else told you, based on what they wanted you to believe. And that's not really a good way to be, is it? Do you trust other people that much? You think of YouTube communities, right? This is another thing I talked about last time, Yuri. You think of YouTube communities, and you have these people that kind of coalesce into a collective of people that think the same way and echo the same opinions. A hugbox, if you will. That's why I called my channel that. Hello. These people coalesce into this place where they're not allowed to think for themselves, and they start acting according to the group. This, like, sort of mob mentality thing, and they don't actually develop into who they really are, and they experience this sort of dissonance, I find, with who they actually are, and they get very frustrated. And I would wager that part of this is from the whole demoralization thing. Usually it starts with, well, you think this, you act like this, you talk like this, you're a piece of shit. Let me tell you how not to be a piece of shit. That shit's a psyop, right? That shit is a homegrown psyop, right? And the thing that really opened my eyes to this was I started streaming on Twitch. And, well, this opened my eyes to this for a couple of reasons when I started streaming on Twitch. One of them was that I started a Discord server, and what I found was that there were about 3 people in that Discord server that were really, really good with manipulating other people into believing shit that wasn't true. And I'm not even talking in a malicious sense. In the sense of, like the U2s, right? I didn't have a U2s at that time. They created a fake U2s and managed to convince, like, the entire fan community that I had a U2s, right? It's very easy within these communities to promulgate false information because nobody wants to be exiled from the community, right? Nobody wants to seem like an asshole. So if a respected member of the community starts saying something, everybody starts to believe it without thinking twice about it. And what I'm just trying to say here is you gotta think for yourself, or else somebody else is thinking for you. There's really no way around it, right?
Distract them from learning something which is constructive, pragmatic, efficient. Instead of mathematics, physics, foreign languages, chemistry, teach them history of urban warfare, natural food, home economy, your sexuality, anything, as long as it takes you away, okay? Social life. Replace traditionally established institutions and organizations with fake organizations. Take away the initiative from people. Take away the responsibility from naturally established links between individuals, group of individuals, and society at large, and replace them with artificially, bureaucratically controlled bodies.
People that I'd consider friends of mine have even told me, they're like, yeah, you know, like, well, when everybody else around me starts, like, acting this way, I feel Like, I have to go along with them because of X, Y, and Z, because they're my community or whatever, right? And I think that's really unhealthy. If the people around you are trying to tell you not to think for yourself and to not be you, and instead fit into this factory mold of a person, I'm not talking in like the, oh yeah, fuck the system, man, kind of like factory mold of a person, but I mean like, when, a perfect example of this is when like social media, not a perfect example, but social media, when they'll come back to you and say, well, we found this information to be false, delete your comment. You know how Facebook does that, right? This is like what happens at a community level, where you almost, it's like North Korea, right? Where you have these sort of people snitching on their neighbors and being like, oh, well, they're not going by the code. The code. You know what I mean? This sort of moralism thing. And in my opinion, there's nothing worse than convincing people to pass the buck on their perspective on the world and to give the responsibility for what is true and finding what is true to other people just because they think they're cooler than them or because they're afraid of being ostracized. That's kind of at the core of Psyops, right? I mean, I'm sure I'm going to put a bunch of Bezmenov clips in here and posts that are going to make a lot of sense, right? And this is going to kind of clarify my argument. But yeah, I think it's really unhealthy, and I think that the internet as it is right now kind of breeds that. It breeds the sort of manipulation of people through social pressures. Which is exactly what Bezmenov talks about most, is social pressures. It's not... He always talks about, you think of like Hollywood spies, you think of them like breaking into buildings and shooting people and stuff, and that's not what spies actually do. Spies convince people of things that aren't true. Right? That's intelligence agencies, right? They're not special forces, they're intelligence. They're not there to kill people. They're there to kill your fucking brain. I think I just ended there, honestly. Yeah, I think that's it. I honestly think that was a one-taker. Perfect. That was a one-taker.
If a heavier person wants to strike me in the face, it would be very naive and counterproductive to stop his blow. The Chinese and Japanese judo art tells us what to do. First to avoid the strike, then to grab the fist and continue his movement in the direction where it was before, right? Until the enemy crashes in the wall. You see? So, what happens here? The target country obviously does something wrong. If it's a free democratic society, there are many different movements within the society. There are obviously, in every society, there are people who are against this society. They may be simple criminals, ideologically in disagreement with the state policy, conscientious enemies, simply psychotic personalities who are against anything, right? And finally, there are a small group of agents of a foreign nation, bought, subverted, recruited, right? The moment all these movements will be directed in one direction, right? This is the time to catch that movement and to continue it until the movement forces the whole society into collapse, into crisis, right? So that's exactly the martial art tactic. We don't stop an enemy. We let him go. We help him to go in the direction we want them to go, okay?